The light did not fade, it vanished. For a Lumerian, that was not merely a loss of vision, it was a sudden, violent amputation of the soul. I remember the exact moment the Lumina Aegis stopped singing. We were drifting through the violet curtains of the Velvet Nebula, a place of celestial peace, or so our star charts promised. High Architect Valora was reclining in the observation tier, her skin glowing with the soft, pale amber of a woman at peace. I was standing 3 meters behind her, recording the rhythmic pulsations of the ship's core, a sound we called the heart song. Then, the heart song died. It wasn't a gradual decline. It was as if a giant hand had reached out and crushed the throat of the universe. The null pulse hit us a microsecond later. I felt it as a physical blow to my brain, a high-frequency shriek that bypassed my ears and went straight for my bioresonant nodes. My knees buckled, my stylus clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a mountain collapsing in the unnatural silence. "Commander! Jackson!" Valora's voice was a ragged whisper. Her amber glow had turned to a sickly, translucent gray. Commander Jackson, the finest blade in the syzygy hegemony, didn't answer. He was on one knee, his iridescent armor dulling as the ship's ambient power was sucked into the void. His plasma lance, a weapon capable of bisecting a moon rover, flickered once and turned into a useless rod of cold metal. "They're inside," Jackson gasped, his lungs struggling to process air that was no longer being conditioned by the ship's electrostatic filters. The breach was not elegant. The Kraden did not use precision cutters. They used brute, magnetic force. 3 muffled thuds vibrated through the floor plating. 1, 2, 3. The reinforced hull of the observation tier groaned, a sound of tortured alloy that made my teeth ache. Then, the bulkhead simply ceased to be. It was punched inward, a jagged circle of wreckage flying across the room and embedding itself in the High Architect's mahogany desk. 4 of them stepped through the smoke. The Kraden were nightmares of meat and machine. Their carapaces were matte black, absorbing what little emergency red light remained. They didn't walk, they stomped, their heavy hydraulic pistons hissing with every predatory step. Their leader was a mountain of chitin, 4 meters tall, carrying a gravity hammer that hummed with the same null pulse that had turned our elite guards into weeping children. "High Architect," the leader's voice box rasped, the translation software struggling with the lack of bandwidth. "You are cargo now." Jackson tried to stand. He was a hero of the Fringe Wars, a man who had faced star beasts without blinking. But against the null pulse, his biology was a traitor. He vomited, the clear bioluminescent fluid of our people staining the pristine floor. The Kraden leader raised his hammer. He wasn't even looking at the guards. He was looking at Valora, who stood with her back against the viewport, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the railing to stay upright. "Check the perimeter!" the leader barked at his subordinates. "If it breathes, break its neck. We don't need witnesses for a kidnapping of this grade." I closed my eyes. I waited for the sound of the hammer falling or the hiss of a kinetic bolt. I waited for the end of the syzygy hegemony, right there on the polished floors of our pride. Instead, I heard a slap. It was a wet, rhythmic sound. Slap, swish, slap, swish. It was coming from the secondary service corridor, a place no Lumerian of standing ever looked at, let alone entered. It was a sound so mundane, so profoundly out of place in the middle of a high-stakes boarding action that even the Kraden leader paused. A man stepped into the red-lit chaos. He wasn't wearing armor. He was wearing a faded gray one-piece jumpsuit with the words "Environmental Technician" stitched over the breast pocket in a language I barely recognized. He was shorter than Jackson, but wider, thick in the shoulders, heavy in the legs. In his hands, he held a long composite shaft with a bundle of gray fibers at the end. A mop. He didn't look at the High Architect. He didn't look at the fallen guards. He looked at the floor that was now covered in the jagged wreckage of the door and the sickness of our soldiers. "Are you kidding me?" the man said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and entirely unimpressed. "I just spent 4 hours waxing this section." The Kraden leader stared at him. The internal sensors in his helmet must have been screaming, trying to categorize this new entity. No energy signature. No bioresonant feedback. Just 94 kilograms of biological mass, standing on 2 legs that didn't seem to realize they were supposed to be shaking. "Identify yourself, meat," the Kraden hissed. The man sighed. He shifted his grip on the mop handle, his knuckles turning white. "The name's Kalin, and you guys are making a real mess of my morning watch." 6 hours before the world went silent, Kaelen Vance was thinking about friction. I remember seeing him in the morning, though I didn't truly see him. To a Lumerian, a Terran janitor is like a piece of background furniture that occasionally moves. You know it's there, you know it serves a purpose, but you don't engage with it. He was kneeling in the grand hallway, his thick hands moving a high-speed buffer over the crystalline floor. I had passed him while carrying a tray of data crystals for the High Architect. I remember the way he smelled, not the sweet floral scent of our atmospheric purifiers, but something sharp and oily, something real. "Watch your step, scribe," he'd said without looking up. "The polish is still wet. Don't want you pulling a header." Eight. I hadn't even thanked him. I had just stepped over his work with a flick of my robes, annoyed that his presence was interrupting the aesthetic symmetry of the hall. He was a heavy lifter, a term Jackson used for the few humans we kept on board. They were hired for the tasks our technology supposedly made obsolete, but which still required a certain stubbornness. The syzygy hegemony prided itself on elegance. Our ships were built of light and song. But light doesn't scrub carbon deposits off plasma conduits, and song doesn't remove the sticky residue left by visiting delegates from the humid moons of Velonas. For that, we had Kalin. He had come to us from a place called Gaia Prime, a colony world where the gravity was 50% higher than the galactic standard. On his planet, a child's first steps were a battle against the very Earth. Every breath was a feat of strength. His people were built like load-bearing architecture. Dense bones, thick muscle fibers, and a cardiovascular system that pumped blood like an industrial piston. To us, he was a barbarian in a janitor's suit. To him, we were probably fragile porcelain dolls living in a house of glass. In the observation tier, the Kraden leader didn't care about Kalen's bone density. He only saw a nuisance. He gestured to one of his subordinates, a scout armed with a shock prod and a sidearm. "Zero that one," the leader said, his voice flat. "Get him out of my sight." The Kraden scout moved with terrifying speed. His hydraulic legs hissed as he covered the distance in 2 strides, his shock prod crackling with enough blue electricity to stop a Lumerian's heart from across the room. He didn't even use his gun. Why waste a bullet on a janitor? Kalin didn't move. He stood there with his mop, his head tilted slightly to the left, as if he were calculating the trajectory of a falling drop of water. "You're overextending," Kalin muttered. The Kraden scout swung the prod. It was a horizontal strike designed to take Kalen's head off. Kalin didn't duck. He didn't parry. He stepped into the strike. On Gaia Prime, momentum was a weapon. If you didn't respect it, it killed you. If you mastered it, you were a god. Kalin caught the scout's wrist with his left hand. a hand that had spent years tightening manual valves and hauling waste containers. The sound of the scout's chitinous armor cracking under the pressure of Kalen's grip was like a dry branch snapping in winter. The shock prod hissed into the air, missing Kalen's ear by a centimeter. Before the scout could even register the pain, Kalin drove the butt of his mop handle upward. It wasn't a swing. It was a short, efficient thrust. The composite shaft hit the scout's neck joint, the one place where the pressurized suit was vulnerable to allow for movement. 200 kilograms of vertical load pressure focused into a point the size of a coin. The scout's head snapped back. His helmet seal shattered, spraying the room with a mist of green coolant. He didn't scream. His vocal cords were crushed instantly. He just folded, his massive mechanical body hitting the floor with a heavy, wet thud. The silence that followed was even deeper than the null pulse. The Kraden leader froze. Jackson, still coughing on the floor, stared up at Kalin with wide, disbelieving eyes. Even High Architect Valora seemed to have forgotten she was being kidnapped. Kalin didn't look heroic. He looked annoyed. He looked at the dead scout, then at the green coolant staining the floor. "That's going to be a nightmare to get out of the grout," Kalin said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Seriously, do you have any idea how hard it is to find a neutral pH cleaner in this sector?" The Kraden leader let out a roar, a sound of pure electronic fury. He raised his gravity hammer, the weapon glowing with a malevolent violet light. "Kill him!" he screamed. "Tear that meat apart!" The remaining two scouts didn't hesitate. They pulled their kinetic slug launchers, heavy, illegal weapons that fired solid tungsten spikes. In the cramped quarters of the observation tier, these guns were death sentences. "Kalin, move!" I found my voice, a tiny, shrill sound. But Kaelen Vance didn't move like a Lumerian. He didn't move like a soldier. He moved like a man who had spent his life working in the dark, dangerous corners of the universe, where the only thing you could trust was physics. He reached into his utility belt and pulled out a small, pressurized canister. It was labeled Vitro Polish, industrial strength. Avoid contact with skin and synthetic membranes. "Time to go to work," Kalin whispered. The first slug launcher fired. The tungsten spike tore through the air, traveling at 3,000 meters per second. It hit the spot where Kalin had been standing a millisecond before. But Kalin wasn't there. He was already low, his heavy legs driving him across the floor in a sliding tackle that would have shattered a Lumerian's pelvis. He wasn't aiming for the scouts. He was aiming for the fire suppression valve near the wreckage of the door. He smashed the valve with the head of his mop. A cloud of white CO2 exploded into the room, turning the red emergency lighting into a blind, swirling fog. To the Kraden, whose sensors were already struggling with the null pulse feedback, the world became a wall of static. But Kalin didn't need sensors. He knew this room. He'd cleaned every square centimeter of it. He knew the distance from the door to the desk. He knew the height of the railing. He knew exactly where the Kraden would be standing, because he knew where the dirt always gathered. I heard a crash in the fog, then a hiss, then the sound of someone choking on something that wasn't air. "1 minute," I heard Kalen's voice, calm and steady amidst the screams. "I can probably get this done in 3 if I don't stop to talk." I huddled against the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I realized then that I had spent my life looking at the stars, thinking they were the only things of value. I had never looked at the man who kept the floors clean. I had never realized that in a universe of light and song, sometimes the only thing that can save you is the man who knows how to handle the grime. The fog began to clear, and through the white mist, I saw a shadow. It was huge. It was heavy, and it was moving with a purpose that made the null pulse feel like a lullaby. Kaelen Vance was no longer a janitor. He was the gravity that was going to pull the Kraden down to hell. The carbon dioxide fog did more than just obscure our vision. For a Lumerian, the fire suppression gas was a thick, suffocating blanket that dampened the very vibrations we used to navigate the world. I was huddled near the base of the High Architect's crystalline dais, my fingers digging into the silver-flecked carpet. Every breath felt like swallowing cold, dry dust. Around me, the world was a ghostscape of shifting white shapes and the rhythmic, terrifying clank of Kraden hydraulics. But in that blinding whiteness, there was one constant: a heartbeat. It was not a frantic thing. It did not stutter or race like my own. It was a deep, low throb, like the engine of a heavy freighter idling in a quiet harbor. I could hear it because the null pulse had stripped away the ship's ambient noise, leaving only the raw biological sounds of the living. To my hypersensitive ears, that Terran heart was a metronome of pure, stubborn defiance. "Stay down, Ilara." Kalen's voice drifted through the fog. It was not a shout. It was the calm instruction of a man telling a coworker to avoid a wet floor. "Don't move until I tell you the air is clear." I heard the whine of a Kraden targeting array trying to lock onto a heat signature. The Kraden were masters of infrared, but the fire suppression gas was specifically designed to disrupt thermal sensors. They were as blind as we were, trapped in a white void of their own making. "Who are you?" the Kraden leader roared, his voice metallic and distorted. His gravity hammer swung blindly through the mist, the sheer displacement of air creating a whistling sound that made my ears bleed. "Show yourself, little ape." I heard Kalin laugh. It was a short, sharp sound, devoid of humor. "You guys always want to talk when you're losing," he said. "It's a bad habit. Makes you slow." A heavy thud echoed from the left, then a mechanical screech of tearing metal. One of the Kraden scouts had found Kalin, or perhaps Kalin had found him. The sound of the struggle was unlike any combat I had ever witnessed in the training circles of the Syzygy Guard. Our warriors fought with grace, with light blades and calculated lunges. Kaelen Vance fought with weight. I heard the mop handle whistle through the air. On Gaia Prime, the air was thicker, the gravity a constant, invisible hand pulling at your soul. To survive there, your muscles had to be more than just strong. They had to be efficient. Kalin wasn't swinging the mop like a sword. He was using it as a lever. I heard a crunch, the unmistakable sound of a high-pressure seal being compromised. "One down," Kalin muttered. His voice was closer now. He was moving through the fog with the silent, practiced ease of someone who had spent 1,000 night shifts navigating cluttered corridors without hitting a single bucket. "2 more of your bolt buckets to go, plus the big guy with the hammer." "How?" I whispered into the cold air. "How can he even see?" The answer came to me as I felt the floor vibrate. Kalin wasn't seeing with his eyes. He was feeling the vibrations through the soles of his boots. He was a creature of gravity, of solid matter. He didn't need the resonance of the stars or the song of the ship. He just needed to know where the floor ended and the enemy began. The second Kraden scout fired his kinetic launcher. The tungsten spike hissed through the air, slamming into a decorative pillar 3 centimeters above my head. The impact sent a shower of crystalline shards raining down on me. I screamed, a thin, pathetic sound that was swallowed by the fog. Kalen's heartbeat didn't skip a single beat. "You're shaking the floor! Scrap heap!" Kalen's voice came from directly behind the shooter. "That's a rookie mistake." There was a wet, slapping sound. The mop head, soaked in industrial-strength cleaning solvent, wrapping around the scout's helmet. I heard the hiss of the chemical reaction. The Vitro Polish was designed to dissolve the toughest carbon stains in the galaxy. Against the synthetic membranes of a Kraden environmental suit, it was like acid. The scout clawed at his face, his electronic vocalizer emitting a high-pitched whine of agony as the seals on his visor began to liquefy. Kalin didn't wait for him to fall. He grabbed the scout by the heavy hydraulic pistons of his shoulders and drove him headfirst into the bulkhead. The sound was thunderous. The entire observation tier seemed to groan under the force of the impact. 94 kilograms of human mass, backed by the momentum of a man who lived in a 1.5 gravity well, was an unstoppable force. The scout's armor didn't just dent, it collapsed. "Two," Kalin said. His breathing was starting to heavy now, a ragged, rhythmic sound that matched the throb of his heart. The Kraden leader had stopped swinging his hammer. He was standing perfectly still, his massive, chitinous head tilted, listening. The fog was starting to settle, the white clouds drifting toward the ventilation grates that were still trying to function on emergency power. "You are no janitor," the leader rasped. His voice held a trace of something I had never expected to hear from a Kraden. Respect. Or perhaps it was just the analytical acknowledgement of a predator encountering a rival. "You are a ghost from the old wars, a Terran shock trooper." Kalin stepped out of the thinning mist. He was 3 meters away from the leader. His gray jumpsuit was stained with green Kraden coolant and white fire suppression powder. His mop handle was bent at a slight angle, the composite fibers at the end dripping with corrosive sludge. "I'm just a guy who wants to finish his shift," Kalin said. He wiped a smear of blood from his lip with the back of his hand. "But if you want to call me a ghost, that's fine. I've been invisible on this ship for 14 months. Another 10 minutes won't hurt." The High Architect Valora shifted beside me. She was looking at Kalin with an expression I couldn't decipher. Her amber glow was returning, a faint, flickering light that pulsed in time with Kalin's heart. She was a being of pure empathy, of sensory connection. In that moment, she wasn't seeing a janitor. She was seeing the raw, unpolished core of humanity. "He is dense," she whispered, her voice carrying a tone of awe. "His soul doesn't float, Ilara. It anchors." The Kraden leader raised his hammer. The violet light of the null pulse flared, the dampening field intensifying until my head felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The last of the fog vanished, sucked into the vents, leaving the 2 combatants standing in the center of the room. The leader was twice Kalen's size. His armor was a fortress of interlocking plates, his weapon a tool of mass destruction. Kalin had a bent stick and a bottle of floor cleaner. "The math doesn't work, Terran," the leader said. "Your bones will snap like dry reeds under this hammer." Kalin didn't look at the hammer. He looked at the floor, the mirror-polished, silver-flecked floor he had spent 4 hours perfecting. "Yeah, well," he said, shifting his feet into a wide, stable stance that seemed to root him to the deck. "Physics doesn't care about your math. It only cares about the follow-through." The Kraden leader moved with a speed that defied his massive bulk. The gravity hammer came down in a vertical arc, a strike intended to turn Kalin and the floor beneath him into a crater of pulverized matter. Kalin didn't jump back. To jump back was to lose your footing, to give up the stability of the ground. Instead, he stepped forward and to the left, a movement so small it looked like he hadn't moved at all. The head of the hammer missed his shoulder by less than 2 centimeters, slamming into the deck with a force that sent a shock wave through the entire room. The silver-flecked floor shattered, beautiful, Expensive crystalline tiles exploded into 1,000 sharp fragments. Kalin didn't flinch. He used the moment of the hammer's impact, the fraction of a second where the weapon was buried in the floor and the leader's momentum was still carrying him downward, to strike. He didn't use the mop. He used his elbow. He drove his right elbow directly into the leader's central ocular sensor, the glowing red eye in the middle of the helmet. The sound was like a hammer hitting a stone. The Kraden's head snapped back, his hydraulic neck pistons hissing in protest. Kalin didn't stop. He was a blur of gray fabric and raw, heavy motion. He dropped the mop handle and grabbed the leader's primary weapon arm with both hands. "On Gaia Prime, we have a saying," Kalin grunted, his muscles bulging as he fought the mechanical strength of the Kraden. "If it's built to withstand a planet's weight, it's built to be a handle." He twisted. He wasn't just using his arms, he was using his entire body, rotating his hips and shifting his weight in a perfect high-gravity pivot. The Kraden's massive arm didn't break. It was made of reinforced carbon steel, but the joint did. The shoulder actuator screamed as it was forced beyond its operational limit. The leader roared, a sound of static and rage, and tried to backhand Kalin with his free hand. Kalin ducked under the blow, his movement economical and precise. He reached to his belt and pulled the second canister of Vitropolish. This one wasn't a liquid. It was a concentrated aerosol foam. He sprayed it directly into the leader's damaged neck joint. The foam expanded instantly, a white, bubbling mass that hissed as it ate through the internal wiring and the delicate fiber-optic cables that connected the leader's brain to his limbs. "You filth," the leader rasped, his movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated as the chemical rot spread through his systems. "You fight like a scavenger." "I'm a janitor," Kalin said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Scavenging is just part of the job description." He stepped inside the leader's guard, his hands finding the seams in the chest plate. He wasn't looking for a killing blow. He was looking for the source of the null pulse. He found it, a small, pulsing device embedded in the leader's wrist gauntlet, protected by a layer of reinforced synthetic glass. Kalin didn't have a tool to break the glass, so he used his head. He grabbed the leader's gauntlet and slammed his own forehead into the glass. The sound of the impact made me sick. I saw blood bloom on Kalen's brow, a bright crimson streak that ran down his face. But the glass didn't break. He did it again, and a third time. On the third strike, the glass shattered. Kalin reached into the jagged opening, his fingers ignoring the razor-sharp shards, and tore the null pulse generator out by its roots. The silence of the ship changed. It was no longer a suffocating, artificial silence. It was a living thing. The heart song of the Lumina Aegis returned with a thunderous surge of power. The overhead lights flared to life, shifting from a dull emergency red to a brilliant, comforting gold. The ventilation systems sighed, a rush of fresh, scented air filling the room. The Kraden leader collapsed. Without the null pulse to dampen the ship's internal defenses, and without his own motor functions, he was just a heap of dying machinery. He hit the floor with a final pathetic clatter of metal. Kalin stood over him, breathing in great, ragged gulps. He was covered in blood, his own and the Kraden's green ichor. He looked down at the shattered null pulse generator in his hand, then tossed it aside like a piece of trash. 3 minutes and 12 seconds, he wheezed, wiping his brow with a bloodied sleeve. 12 seconds over. I'm getting slow in my old age. Commander Jackson was the first to move. He scrambled to his feet, his plasma lance igniting with a hum of pure, lethal energy. He looked at the wreckage of the room, at the 3 dead Kraden scouts, and at the man in the gray jumpsuit, who was now leaning heavily against the High Architect's desk. Jackson's face went through a dozen different emotions: confusion, shame, anger, and finally, a cold, professional mask. "Step away from the High Architect, Terran," Jackson barked, his lance leveled at Kaelin's chest. "You are in possession of a kinetic weapon. Drop it." Kalin looked at the kinetic slug launcher he had picked up from the floor without even realizing it. He looked at Jackson, then at the lance. A tired, cynical smile touched his lips. "You're welcome, Commander," Kalin said softly. Valora stood up. She didn't look at Jackson. She walked past the guards, past the smoking wreckage of her office, and stopped 10 centimeters in front of Kalin. She was a tall being, but she had to look up to meet his eyes. Her skin was glowing with a deep, vibrant amber, the color of gratitude, of profound realization. She reached out a long, iridescent finger and touched the blood on his forehead. "You are hurt, Kaelen Vance," she said. "I've had worse," Kalin replied, his voice losing its edge as he looked at her. "Once dropped a waste bin on my toe in a 3G hangar. That was a bad day. This is just a messy shift." She didn't pull her hand away. I saw the way her fingers lingered on his skin, feeling the heat, the density, the sheer physical reality of him. To us, touch was a delicate thing, a subtle exchange of frequencies. To him, it was a solid, grounding weight. "You saved my life," she said. "You saved this ship. And you did it with—" She looked at the bent mop handle on the floor. "With the tools of a servant." Kalin straightened his back, his ribs protesting with a sharp wince he couldn't quite hide. "A tool is only as good as the hand holding it, Your Majesty. And I've been holding these tools for a long time." He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the shattered tiles and the spreading stains of coolant and fire foam. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life. "Look at this place," he muttered. "I'm going to need a full crew and at least 6 hours of heavy-duty stripping to get these floors back to standard. And that desk? That's mahogany from Earth. You can't just buy that at a colony mart." Jackson stepped forward, his lance still humming. "High Architect, this man is a security risk. He has demonstrated combat capabilities far beyond his stated profile. We need to take him to the brig for questioning." Valora turned to her commander. Her amber glow didn't fade, but it sharpened, becoming a cold, brilliant light that made Jackson flinch. "He is not going to the brig, Commander," she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of the Syzygy throne. "He is going to the medical bay, and you are going to help him get there. But Your Majesty—" "That was not a request, Jackson," she interrupted. "This man did in 3 minutes what you and your entire guard could not do in an hour. He has earned his place on this ship, and he has earned my regard." Kalin looked between the two of them, then back at the floor. He picked up his bent mop handle and slung it over his shoulder like a soldier's rifle. "Medical bay can wait," he said, already turning toward the door. "I need to get the industrial vacuum from Section 7. If that coolant dries into the carpet, we'll never get the smell out." He started walking. He was limping, his left side hitched in pain, his breathing still ragged. He didn't look back at the Queen or the soldiers. He didn't look at me, the scribe who had ignored him for over a year. He just walked out into the corridor, his heavy boots making a solid, rhythmic sound on the deck. Clomp, clomp, clomp. I stood there, watching him go, and I felt a strange, uncomfortable sensation in my chest. It was the feeling of a world being redefined. For 22 years, I had believed that power was something that glowed, something that sang, something that was beautiful and light. I was wrong. Power was a man in a gray jumpsuit, covered in grime and blood, who cared enough about a floor to fight a war for it. Power was the weight that held the world together when the light went out. High Architect Valora watched him until he disappeared around the corner. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Ilara," she said quietly. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Make sure you record everything," she said, her eyes fixed on the spot where Kalin had stood. "Don't leave out the blood. Don't leave out the mop. And especially, don't leave out the heart rate." 61 beats per minute, I whispered, checking my data crystal. 61, she repeated, a small, sad smile touching her lips. He wasn't even afraid. I looked at my notes, at the elegant, flowing script of our people. I realized then that my language didn't have enough words for someone like Kaelen Vance. I would have to invent new ones. Words for the strength of bone, for the stubbornness of muscle, and for the quiet, invisible heroism of a man who did his job when the universe was screaming for him to die. I looked at the floor, the ruined, messy, beautiful floor. "I think I'm going to need a bigger data crystal," I said. The High Architect laughed, a soft, musical sound that filled the wreckage of the room with a sudden, unexpected hope. "I think we're all going to need a lot of things, Ilara. But for now, let us start with a broom." She walked over to where Kalin had dropped a pile of cleaning rags. She picked one up, her iridescent fingers contrasting sharply with the rough gray fabric. She looked at it for a moment, then began to wipe a smear of Kraden ichor from the edge of her desk. The High Architect of the Syzygy hegemony was Don Depp. It was the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen. But as I watched her, I realized that she wasn't just cleaning a desk. She was learning. She was reaching out across the gravity well, trying to find the anchor that Kaelen Vance had left behind. The Lumina Aegis sailed on, through the violet curtains of the Velvet Nebula. The heart song was loud and clear now, a symphony of technology and light. But beneath it, if you listened very closely, you could hear something else. The rhythmic slap of a mop on a freshly polished floor. The sound of a man finishing his shift. The sound of a world that refused to fall. I stood in the center of the observation tier for a long time after they had all gone. The silence was different now. It was the silence of a house after a storm, full of the echoes of things that had been broken and things that had been saved. I looked at my hand. It was trembling. I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just recording history. I was feeling it. I was feeling the friction of the world, the heat of a human body, and the incredible, terrifying weight of being alive. I picked up my stylus and began to write. Chapter 3. The Entry Protocol. I wrote about the fog. I wrote about the heartbeat. And I wrote about the man who walked into a war and saw only a mess that needed Don Depp. I wrote until the suns of the Syzygy system began to rise over the horizon, their light catching the silver-flecked ruins of the floor and turning them into 1,000 tiny stars. It was a beautiful mess. And for the first time, I understood that beauty didn't have to be perfect. Sometimes, the most beautiful thing in the universe is the grime you have to fight for. The medical bay of the Lumina Aegis was less a room of healing and more a sanctuary of light. It was a circular chamber, 40 meters in diameter, where the walls were made of a translucent, honey-colored polymer that hummed with a low-frequency restorative vibration. To a Lumerian, this place was the pinnacle of civilization. Here, our injuries were not stitched or cauterized. They were sang back into wholeness by harmonic emitters and light baths. But as I stood in the doorway, clutching my data crystal to my chest, I realized that our sanctuary was currently having a nervous breakdown. The primary med auto, a sophisticated hovering unit shaped like a silver teardrop, was circling Kaelen Vance with a frantic, high-pitched whirring sound. Its scanners were pulsing a deep, agitated violet. Non-standard skeletal density detected, the med auto's melodic voice announced, though it sounded strained. Structural failure imminent. Multiple calcified growths identified in thoracic region. Attempting emergency dissolution of mineral mass. "Hey! Back off, you oversized toaster!" Kalen's voice rasped. He was sitting on a levitation slab, though he had deactivated the lift field because he said it made him feel like he was floating in a bowl of soup. He was stripped to the waist, and for the first time, I saw the sheer, terrifying reality of a human body. He was a landscape of trauma. His skin, pale and dusted with the white powder of the fire suppression gas, was mapped with deep purple-black bruising that wrapped around his left side like a predator's grip. Two of his ribs were visibly displaced, creating a jagged ridge beneath his muscle. His shoulders were broad, thick with the kind of heavy, functional muscle you only see in pack animals or ancient earth movers. "Your machine thinks my bones are tumors, Ilara," Kalin said, spotting me in the doorway. He let out a dry, hacking cough that made him wince. "It keeps trying to dissolve my rib cage. If you don't tell this gearhead to stand down, I'm going to have to scrap it." "Med Auto, cease scanning," I commanded, my voice trembling. "Subject is Terran. Adjust parameters to high-gravity biological baseline." The machine paused, its violet light flickering back to a calm blue. Recalibrating. Warning: biological heat signature is 37 degrees Celsius. Extreme fever detected. Recommendation: full-body immersion in cooling gel. "I'm not getting in the goop," Kalin muttered, reaching out with his right hand to grab a clean rag from a nearby tray. He began to wipe the Kraden ichor from his arm. "I just need a wrap, and maybe something for the ache. I've been beat to hell before. This isn't my first rodeo." "Rodeo?" I asked, stepping closer. The air around him was hot. It wasn't the sterile, filtered warmth of the ship. It was the radiating, humid heat of a furnace. It was a heat that smelled of salt, iron, and a stubborn, living energy. "Old Earthward," he said, his eyes narrowing as he gingerly touched the bruising on his side. "Means a lot of dust, a lot of noise, and getting thrown into the dirt by something bigger than you. Usually for fun. This time, not so much fun." I watched him. He was a man who had just saved a star system, yet he was sitting on a cold slab, arguing with a robot about his own bones. The humanistic theme I had been taught, that all life is a delicate song, felt hollow in the face of this man. Kalin wasn't a song. He was an avalanche. He was the heavy, blunt reality that our elegant civilization had spent centuries trying to forget. The door chided softly, and High Architect Valora entered. She had changed her robes. She now wore a simple, unadorned gown of white silk that shimmered with her internal amber light. Behind her, Commander Jackson stood like a statue, his hand never leaving the hilt of his restored plasma blade. He looked at Kalin with a mixture of professional suspicion and something that looked a lot like fear. "Leave us," Valora said to the med auto and to the two Lumerian nurses who were hovering nervously in the shadows. "High Architect," Jackson protested. The security protocols failed 3 hours ago, Commander," Valora said, her voice like a chime of glass. "Mr. Vance did not. I will be safe in his presence." Jackson stiffened, his iridescent skin flushing a deep, angry indigo, but he bowed and stepped back into the corridor. I made to follow him, but Valora raised a hand. "Stay, Ilara. You are the scribe. This is a moment that must be weighted correctly. She walked toward Kalin. She didn't stop at a respectful distance. She walked until she was standing directly in the heat shadow of his body. She looked at the bruising, at the blood, and at the mechanical watch on his wrist that was still ticking away the seconds of a world that had almost ended. "You are in pain," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've had worse shifts," Kalin said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He looked at her, and for a moment, the janitor and the queen were just two beings in a quiet room. But yeah, that hammer had some real kick to it. Felt like being hit by a freight train. "A freight train," Valora repeated, the words unfamiliar on her tongue. "You speak in the language of machines and weight. Even your metaphors are heavy." "That's because the universe is heavy, Your Majesty," Kalin said. He took a deep breath, his chest rattling. "You Lumerians, you live in the rafters. You live in the light and the high notes. But someone has to live in the foundations. Someone has to understand how much pressure the pillars can take before they snap." Valora reached out. She didn't touch his skin this time. She hovered her hand a few centimeters above the bruising on his ribs. Her amber light intensified, a soft, golden warmth that seemed to bleed into the air. "On my world," she said softly, "we believe that suffering is a dissonance, a broken note in the great composition. We spend our lives trying to tune it out. We build ships that don't hum, floors that don't scuff, and lives that don't hurt." "Sounds nice," Kalin said, "but it's a lie, isn't it?" Valora's hand trembled. "Yes, it is a lie, because when the null pulse hit, our song didn't just stop, it shattered us. We were so tuned to the perfection of the ship that we had no strength of our own. We were hollow." She looked into Kalen's eyes, the dull brown eyes of a man from a world of dirt. "But you were not hollow. Your heart rate remained at 61 beats per minute while a Kraden warlord tried to crush your skull." "Why?" Kalin looked away, his gaze falling on his bent mop handle leaning against the wall. "Because on Gaia Prime, fear is a luxury we can't afford. If you're scared of the dark, you don't mind the ore. If you're scared of the cold, you don't plant the crops. If you're scared of the weight, you don't build the home. We acted because we had to, not because we were brave, but because the alternative was being buried." "Action despite fear," I whispered, recording the words. "That is the definition of courage." "No," Kalin said, his voice turning sharp. "That's the definition of a job. Don't go making it poetic, scribe. It's just work. You do what needs to be done, so the people you care about don't have to live in the grime." Valora pulled her hand back, her light dimming to a thoughtful glow. "The people you care about. You have a family on Earth?" Kalen's expression softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something ancient and tender passing over his rugged features. "A sister, 3 nephews. They think I'm a high-flying space explorer. I send them credits every month. Tell them the stars are beautiful." "You don't tell them you're a janitor?" I asked. Kalin looked at me, a bitter smile on his face. "Would you? In a galaxy full of architects and commanders and scribes who wants to hear that their uncle is the guy who scrubs the toilets on a rich man's yacht? No. I'm an environmental technician." It sounds better in the letters. The cost of his invisibility hit me then. He wasn't just invisible to us. He was making himself invisible to the people he loved, as if his work, the very work that had just saved us all, was something to be ashamed of. We had built a hierarchy where the most essential people were the ones we were trained to ignore, and Kalin had accepted that burden as his price for survival. The peace of the medical bay was shattered by a sudden, jarring alarm. not the melodic chime of the ship's usual alerts, but a harsh, grinding klaxon that vibrated through the floor. Hull integrity compromised in Section 12, the ship's voice announced. Internal security locks disengaged. Unauthorized drive core access detected. Valora stiffened. The Kraden are all secured. How is this possible? Kalin was already off the slab. He groaned as he stood, his hand clutching his ribs, but his movements were fast and purposeful. He grabbed his jumpsuit and pulled it on over his bruised torso, his jaw set in a grim line. It wasn't just the Kraden, Kalin said, his voice dropping into a low tactical register. I saw the breach locks. They didn't just find the hull. They had the exact coordinates of the shield harmonics. Someone on this ship opened the door for them. A traitor? I gasped. Among the High Architect's personal staff? Someone who thinks your great composition needs a few new notes, Kalin said. He looked at Valora. Your Majesty, the main bridge is probably a kill zone by now. If they have the drive core, they can vector this ship into the heart of a sun before Jackson can get his boots on. What do we do? Valora asked. She didn't look at Jackson, who was now pounding on the medical bay door trying to get in. She looked at Kalin. We go down, Kalin said. We go into the guts of the ship, the maintenance tunnels, the places where your sensors don't reach and your light doesn't shine. It's the only way to reach the core without being seen. I have never been in the maintenance tunnels, Valora said, her voice small. I know, Kalin said. He reached out and grabbed his mop handle, using it as a cane. That's why you're lucky I'm the one who's been cleaning them for 14 months. Let's move. We're burning daylight. The maintenance tunnels of the Lumina Aegis were not meant for sentient beings. They were meant for conduits, plasma feeds, and the slow, mechanical hum of the ship's digestive system. The walls were made of dull, unpolished lead alloy, and the only light came from the occasional spark of a faulty junction box or the dim amber glow emanating from High Architect Valora's skin. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and recycled grease. It was a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press against my lungs. I followed behind Valora, who was struggling to maintain her regal composure in a space that was barely 2 meters high. She had to crouch, her silken robes dragging through a pool of dark, viscous hydraulic fluid. This is unacceptable, I heard her whisper to herself. But she didn't stop. She kept her eyes on the broad gray back of Kaelen Vance, who was moving through the darkness like he was born to it. Watch your head, Your Majesty, Kalin called back. He didn't turn around. He was using his mop handle to probe the floor ahead of them, checking for loose plating or electrified spills. There's a low-hanging coolant pipe in 3 meters. If you hit that, we'll all be breathing liquid nitrogen. How can you be so casual about this, Kalin? Valora asked, her voice echoing in the narrow tunnel. This ship is dying. My people are in danger, and we are crawling through the filth like insects. Insects are the only thing that survive an apocalypse, Your Majesty, Kalin said. He stopped at a heavy, circular hatch and began to turn the manual wheel. The metal groaned, a sound of rust and neglected maintenance. And as for being casual, this is my office. I spend 8 hours a day down here. You call it filth. I call it the reason your lights stay on. He heaved the hatch open. A gust of hot, foul-smelling air rushed out, nearly knocking me off my feet. Beyond the hatch lay a vertical shaft that dropped away into a bottomless pit of shadows and humming machinery. This is the secondary lift shaft, Kalin said, pointing to a series of narrow metal rungs bolted to the wall. It leads directly to the drive core's cooling manifold. If the traitor is trying to sabotage the ship, that's where he'll be. It's the only place you can bypass the main bridge's overrides. Valora looked down into the pit. Her amber light flickered, her skin turning a shade paler. "We have to climb?" "Gravity's a bitch, isn't it?" Kalin said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting her light. "I'll go first. If you slip, I'm a big target. I'll catch you. Ilara, you stay between us. Don't look down. Just focus on the rungs." "I can't do this," I whimpered, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped my data crystal. "I'm a scribe. I record things. I don't climb pipes." Kalin reached out and grabbed my shoulder. His hand was enormous, his grip firm and steadying. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me until I stopped shaking. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The world doesn't care what you are. It only cares what you do. Right now, you're the woman who's going to help save this ship. So grab the damn rung and move. You can write the poem about it later." His bluntness was like a cold splash of water. I nodded, swallowed my fear, and reached for the metal. The climb was an eternity of pain and darkness. Every muscle in my body screamed as I hauled myself up, centimeter by grueling centimeter. Above me, Valora moved with a clumsy, desperate grace, her robes tearing on the jagged edges of the shaft. Below me, I could hear Kalen's heavy, labored breathing. Each breath was a ragged struggle, a reminder of the fractured ribs he was ignoring to keep us moving. "You're doing great," Kaelen grunted from below. "Just another 10 meters. Think about that nice, clean bed back in your quarters." "I'm thinking about the floor," Valora gasped from above. "I'm thinking about how much work it will take to clean my skin after this." Kalin let out a short bark of a laugh. Spoken like a true apprentice. "Maybe there's hope for you yet, Your Majesty." We reached a small, cramped platform near the top of the shaft. Kalin pulled himself up last, his face drenched in sweat, his left arm hanging limp at his side. He leaned against the wall, his eyes closed for a moment, his chest heaving. "We're here," he whispered. "Section 14. The drive core is just through that bulkhead." He gestured to a heavy, reinforced door that was pulsing with a rhythmic golden light. But before he could move toward it, the door hissed open. A figure stepped out. It was a Lumerian, tall and elegant, wearing the high-collared robes of the High Architect's Inner Council. His skin was a brilliant, shimmering silver, and his eyes were like twin stars. In his hand, he held a sleek, black device that looked like a modified null-pulse generator. "Counselor Valerius," Valora gasped, her voice full of a betrayal that felt sharper than any Kraden blade. "You? Why?" Valerius looked at us, his expression one of cold, intellectual disdain. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who had made a logical choice and was waiting for the rest of the universe to catch up. "The Syzygy hegemony is a stagnant pool, Valora," Valerius said, his voice as smooth as polished silk. "We have spent 3 centuries perfecting our song, only to find that the rest of the galaxy has learned how to scream. The Kraden were not an enemy. They were a test that you and your pathetic guards failed." "You killed Jackson's men," I shouted, my anger momentarily overriding my fear. "You let those monsters onto our ship." "I allowed the future to enter," Valerius corrected me, his eyes never leaving Valora. "The Kraden understand the truth of the universe. Strength is the only harmony that matters. By merging our technology with their raw power, we will become something the galaxy has never seen. A new composition. One that cannot be silenced." "By becoming monsters?" Valora asked, her amber light flaring with a sudden fierce heat. "By becoming survivors," Valerius replied. He raised the black device. The Kraden failed to capture you, but the drive core is already primed. In 5 minutes, the Lumina Aegis will make a jump into the heart of the Kraden territory. You will be a guest of their high command, and I will be the one who lead our people into the new age." He looked at Kalin then, his lip curling in a sneer. "And you, the human, a curious anomaly. You are like a piece of grit in a fine watch. You caused a momentary friction, but in the end, you are still just grit. You do not belong in this story." Kalin didn't answer. He didn't look at Valerius. He looked at the floor, his eyes narrowing, his hand tightening on the mop handle. "You talk a lot, Shiny," Kalin said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "In my neighborhood, guys who talk that much usually have something to hide, like the fact that they've never actually been in a fight." Valerius laughed, a cold, empty sound. "A fight? You think this is a tavern brawl on your primitive mud ball? I am a master of the resonance. I can shatter your nervous system with a thought." He pressed a button on the device. A wave of invisible pressure hit us, a localized null pulse that made my vision swim and my heart stutter. Valora fell to her knees, her amber light flickering and dying. But Kaelen Vance didn't fall. He groaned, his heavy frame shuddering under the force of the pulse, but his dense, Terran nerves held. On Gaia Prime, the very ground you walked on tried to crush you every day. A little bit of electronic static wasn't enough to stop a man who had spent 30 years fighting gravity. "Is that all you got?" Kalin rasped. He took a step forward, his heavy boots clanging on the metal platform. "Because I've had static shocks from a faulty vacuum cleaner that had more kick than that." Valerius's eyes widened. He pressed the button again, the device whining as it drew more power from the ship's core. "Impossible! Your biology should be liquefying." "My biology is 90% stubbornness and 10% bad coffee," Kalin growled. He took another step. He was 2 meters away now. He looked like a titan of old, a creature of iron and blood rising out of the darkness of the ship's guts. "Stay back!" Valerius screamed, his silver skin turning a frantic shade of violet. He dropped the device and reached for a concealed light blade at his waist. Kalin didn't wait for him to ignite it. He didn't use the mop handle. He used his weight. He launched himself forward in a low, powerful tackle. He hit Valerius with the force of a runaway cargo hauler. The two of them slammed into the bulkhead, the sound of the impact echoing through the tunnels. Valerius was a Lumerian of high birth, elegant and light. Against Kalen's 94 kilograms of high-gravity mass, he was like a bird hitting a stone wall. The air was knocked out of his lungs in a sharp, wheezing gasp. The light blade clattered to the floor, unignited. Kalin pinned him against the wall with his good arm, his face centimeters away from the counselors. "You want to talk about the future?" Kalin whispered, his voice full of a terrifying, quiet fury. "The future is built by the people who show up for work, the people who sweep the floors, who fix the pipes, and who don't sell out their friends for a fancy new title. You're not a visionary, Valerius. You're just a piece of trash that I forgot to bag up." He drove his fist into Valerius's jaw, a single, solid blow. The counselor's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped to the floor, unconscious. Kalin stood over him for a moment, his body shaking with exhaustion. He looked at his hand, then at the unconscious traitor. He let out a long, shuddering breath and turned to Valora, who was starting to recover from the pulse. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice cracking. Valora looked at him, then at the fallen counselor. She stood up slowly, her amber light returning, softer and more stable than before. She walked over to Kalin and, for the first time, She didn't look at him like a queen looking at a subject. She looked at him like a survivor looking at her savior. "I am alive," she said. "Thanks to you. Again." Kalin nodded, then his knees buckled. He sank to the floor, his back against the bulkhead, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. "Kalin!" I cried, rushing to his side. "I'm fine," he wheezed, waving me away. "Just give me a minute. The engine, the drive core. You have to stop the jump." Valora didn't hesitate. She stepped over Valerius and ran to the control panel near the drive core door. Her fingers moved over the holographic interface with a speed and precision I had never seen. "The sequence is locked," she shouted. "Valerius used a master override code. I can't stop it from here." "The coolant manifold," Kalen's voice came from the shadows. He was leaning his head back against the wall, his eyes closed. "If you purge the manifold, the core will hit a thermal safety shutdown. It'll kill the drive, but it'll save the ship. If I purge the manifold, the maintenance tunnels will be flooded with liquid nitrogen," Valora cried. "We'll be frozen in seconds." Kalin opened his eyes. He looked at her, a calm, steady gaze that seemed to bridge the infinite gap between their worlds. "There's a manual override in the subchamber below us," Kalin said. "It's shielded. One person can stay in there and pull the lever. The shield will hold long enough for the core to cool down." "Who goes?" I asked, my voice trembling. Kalin didn't say anything. He just looked at the hatch we had just climbed out of. "No," Valora said, her voice full of a sudden, sharp pain. "Kalin, you can't. You're injured. You won't make it back up the shaft." "I'm not coming back up, Your Majesty," Kalin said. He managed a small, tired smile. "I'm a janitor. I'm the guy who stays behind to make sure the place is clean for the next shift. It's what I do." "You are more than a janitor," I shouted, tears stinging my eyes. "You are the hero of the Aegis. You are Kaelen Vance of Earth." Kalin looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of pride in his eyes. Not the arrogant pride of a counselor or the cold pride of a guard, but the quiet, enduring pride of a man who knew his value. "Tell my sister. Tell her the stars were beautiful," he whispered. "And tell her I kept the floors clean." He rolled toward the hatch and dropped back into the darkness. "Kalin!" Valora screamed, reaching for him. But he was gone. A second later, I heard the sound of the sub-chamber hatch slamming shut. Then, a low, rumbling vibration shook the entire ship. The drive core's golden light vanished, replaced by a cold blue mist that began to pour into the tunnel. The heart song of the Aegis changed, falling into a low, mournful hum of a machine entering a deep sleep. The ship didn't jump. We were safe. I stood in the darkness, the cold blue mist swirling around my feet, and I realized that the silence was back. But it wasn't the silence of a void. It was the silence of a sacrifice. High Architect Valora stood by the hatch, her hands pressed against the cold metal, her amber light glowing with a sorrow that was deeper than any song. "He anchored us," she whispered. "In the end, he was the only thing that held us to the world." I picked up my data crystal and began to write. Not as a scribe recording a history, but as a person recording a life. Chapter 6. The Guts of the Aegis. And for the first time, I didn't worry about the elegance of the words. I just wrote the truth. I wrote about the weight, the grime, and the man who was too dense to be broken. I wrote about the invisible man who had finally, in the darkness of a maintenance tunnel, become the most visible thing in the universe. The silence that followed the drive core shutdown was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping ship. It was the absolute, terrifying stillness of a tomb. The liquid nitrogen purge had turned the maintenance tunnels into a landscape of jagged white frost and lethal swirling mists. Through the honey-colored walls of the medical bay, the emergency lights flickered with a rhythmic, dying pulse, casting long, distorted shadows across the face of High Architect Valora. She was still standing by the hatch, her iridescent fingers pressed so hard against the frozen metal that her own bioluminescent amber glow was beginning to dim from the sheer cold. She didn't look like a queen. She looked like a woman who had just watched the horizon vanish. "He's gone," I whispered, the words puffing out in a small cloud of frozen breath. My data crystal was cold in my hand, its internal light stuttering. The nitrogen. The temperature in the subchamber must have dropped to negative 190 degrees Celsius in less than 5 seconds. No biological system can survive that. Not even a Terran. Valora didn't turn around. "He told me his bones were like load-bearing architecture, Ilara. He told me he was built for the weight of the world." Her voice was a fragile thread, stripped of its courtly resonance. How can the architecture hold when the air itself turns to ice? Behind us, the medical bay door was suddenly wrenched open. Commander Jackson burst in, followed by a dozen elite guards in full environmental combat gear. Their plasma lances were ignited, casting a harsh, artificial blue light over the room. They looked ready to fight a war, but the war was already over, and the victor was a man they had spent 14 months stepping over in the hallways. "High Architect!" Jackson shouted, his voice muffled by his armored visor. "We have secured the secondary bridge. The Kraden boarding parties are being hunted down. Counselor Valerius, is he here?" Valora finally turned. She looked at Jackson, then at the guards, her eyes moving over their pristine, shining armor with an expression of profound, quiet contempt. She gestured vaguely toward the unconscious silver figure of Valerius, who was slumped against the bulkhead like a discarded toy. "There is your traitor, Commander," she said. "He is unconscious. He was defeated by a man with a broken rib and a cleaning implement. I suggest you bind him before he wakes up and realizes how thoroughly he has been humiliated." Jackson blinked, his gaze shifting from the counselor to the open hatch. "Where is the human? Where is Vance?" "He is in the subchamber," I said, stepping forward. I could feel the heat leaving my body, the cold of the tunnel below beginning to seep through the deck plating. He triggered the manual purge. He stopped the jump. Jackson's eyes widened behind his visor. He walked to the edge of the hatch and peered down into the darkness. A wisp of blue nitrogen fog drifted up, instantly crystallizing on his armor. He recoiled, his sensors chirping a frantic warning. "The manifold is flooded," Jackson said, his voice dropping an octave. "That subchamber is a dead zone. If he's down there, he's KIA, killed in action." "Don't use your military slang to diminish what he did, Jackson," Valora snapped. It was the first time I had ever heard her use a subordinate's name without a title. He didn't die in action. He died in service. He died because he was the only one on this ship who understood that a house cannot stand if the foundations are left to rot. She walked toward Jackson, her amber light flaring with a sudden, icy intensity. "And you. You called him a security risk. You wanted to put him in the brig while he was still bleeding for us. You spent your life training for the high notes, and you let a janitor save your soul." Jackson lowered his head, the blue light of his lance reflecting off the floor. "High Architect, we must evacuate this level. The nitrogen leak is localized, but the atmospheric scrubbers are struggling. It isn't safe for you." "I will not leave him," Valora said. "Your Majesty, there is nothing to be done," Jackson pleaded. "The subchamber is sealed from the inside. We don't even have the manual override codes for the lower maintenance locks. Only the engineering staff has those, and most of them were neutralized during the initial breach. I have the codes, I said. Every head in the room turned toward me. I felt the weight of their gaze, the heavy, judgmental silence of the elite. I clutched my data crystal tighter. I'm a scribe, I said, my voice gaining a strength I didn't know I possessed. It is my job to record the systems of this ship. I spent the last 6 months cataloging the maintenance protocols for the High Architect's annual review. I know the override for the sub-chamber. Kalin showed me how to access the manual port 3 weeks ago while he was fixing a leak in the scribe's archives. He said it was good to know how the plumbing worked, just in case the fancy stuff went south. Valora's expression softened, a flicker of hope returning to her eyes. Alara, can you open the hatch from here? Not from here, I said, looking at the data crystal. The terminal is in the sub-corridor, 20 meters down the shaft. Someone has to go down. Someone has to endure the cold. I'll go, Jackson said, stepping forward. My armor is rated for extreme environments. Your armor is too bulky, I countered, checking the schematics. The override port is behind a narrow cable conduit. Only someone smaller can reach it. And your plasma lance will cause a thermal feedback loop with the nitrogen. You'll blow the manifold and the whole ship with it. Valora stepped toward the hatch. She began to unfasten the silken ties of her outer robe, letting the expensive, shimmering fabric fall to the floor. Underneath, she wore a simple, functional undersuit of gray-white weave. "High Architect! No!" Jackson shouted, reaching out to stop her. She brushed his hand aside with a gesture of such absolute authority that he froze. "You have spent your life protecting my body, Commander. Now, for the first time, I am going to ask you to protect my choice. I am the High Architect. I am the one who designs the world. And I refuse to live in a world where Kaelen Vance is left in the dark." She looked at me. "Alara, give me the codes, and tell me what I need to do." I felt a lump in my throat. I was watching the transformation of a goddess into a woman. For centuries, the Lumerian leaders had been distant, ethereal figures, separated from the physical reality of their ships by layers of ceremony and technology. Valora was breaking that chain. She was choosing the weight. She was choosing the grime. "The code is Alpha 79er Echo," I whispered. "There is a manual lever inside the conduit. You have to pull it toward you, then rotate it 90 degrees clockwise. It will be heavy, Your Majesty. It will be heavier than anything you have ever moved." Valora nodded. She didn't look afraid. She looked focused. "Wait," she said, repeating Kalen's favorite word. "I think I am beginning to understand its value." She turned to the hatch and, without another word, disappeared into the blue, swirling mist of the maintenance shaft. The descent into the maintenance shaft was a journey into a frozen hell. For Valora, the cold was not just a physical sensation, it was a sensory assault. Lumerians experienced temperature through their entire skin surface, our bioresonant nodes reacting to the vibration of molecules. When those molecules slowed down to the point of freezing, it felt like 1,000,000 tiny needles were being driven into her nerves. She clung to the metal rungs, her iridescent skin turning a dull, painful gray. The nitrogen fog was thick here, a silent white ghost that clung to her robes and clouded her vision. She couldn't hear the heart song of the ship anymore. All she could hear was the frantic, uneven thud of her own heart and the distant metallic groan of the frozen hull. "Don't look down," she told herself, repeating Kalen's advice. "Just focus on the rungs." She reached the sub-corridor after what felt like an eternity. The floor was covered in a thick layer of frost that crunched under her boots. Every breath was a struggle, the freezing air burning her throat. She found the cable conduit, a narrow, dark opening behind a cluster of pulsing plasma pipes. She reached inside. Her fingers were numb, the joints stiff and unyielding. She felt the cold metal of the manual lever. It was frozen in place, a thick crust of ice locking it into the bulkhead. "Please," she gasped, her voice a ragged whisper. "Kalin, give me some of your stubbornness." She grabbed the lever with both hands. She braced her feet against the floor, exactly as she had seen Kalin do during the fight in the observation tier. She centered her weight. She stopped trying to be light. She embraced the gravity. She pulled. The ice cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The lever didn't move. She pulled again, her muscles screaming, her amber light flickering dangerously low as she poured every ounce of her life force into the effort. "I am the High Architect," she hissed through gritted teeth, "and I order you to move." With a sudden, violent lurch, the lever gave way. She rotated it 90 degrees, the sound of grinding metal echoing through the shaft. A heavy, muffled thud vibrated through the deck plating. Above her, the secondary hatch of the sub-chamber began to hiss open. The nitrogen fog was sucked back into the recycling vents as the pressure equalized. Valora didn't wait for the air to clear. She scrambled toward the hatch, her hands raw and bleeding from the frozen metal. She pulled herself over the lip of the sub-chamber and fell onto the floor. It was a small, cramped space, dominated by the massive, humming manifold of the drive core. Everything was covered in a fine, white powder of frozen coolant. In the center of the room, leaning against the primary shut-off valve, was a figure. Kaelen Vance looked like a statue carved from ice. His eyes were closed, his head resting back against the cold metal. His gray jumpsuit was stiff with frost, his hands still gripped around the manual purge wheel. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. "Kalin," Valora whispered, crawling across the floor toward him. The heat of her body felt like a tiny, pathetic flame in the middle of a blizzard. "Kalin, wake up." She reached him and pulled him into her arms. He was cold, so cold that it felt like holding a block of stone. She pressed her ear to his chest, desperate for the sound that had anchored her during the storm. Silence. "No," she sobbed, her tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. "No, you can't leave me with this floor, Kalin. I don't know how to clean it. I don't know how to be the anchor." She began to glow. It wasn't the soft, amber light of a queen at peace. It was a fierce, radiant gold, a sunfire born of desperation and a love that she was only just beginning to name. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her skin against his, trying to pour her own warmth, her own bioresonance, into his frozen heart. 61 beats, she commanded, her light illuminating the dark corners of the sub-chamber. "I order you to give me 61 beats." For a long time, nothing happened. The ship hummed around them, a mournful, steady drone. Then, a tiny vibration hit Valora's chest. Thump. It was weak, it was slow, but it was there. Thump. Thump. Kalen's body shuddered. A long, rattling breath escaped his blue lips, a cloud of white frost that dissipated in Valora's golden light. His eyes flickered open, dull and unfocused, searching for the world. You're late," he wheezed, his voice a ghost of a sound. Valora let out a cry of joy, a sound that was half laugh and half sob. She held him tighter, her light pulsing in time with his returning heartbeat. "I know. I'm sorry. I had trouble with the lever." Kalin looked at her, his vision slowly clearing. He saw the gray undersuit, the blood on her hands and the fierce, unregal light in her eyes. He saw the woman who had crawled through the guts of her own ship to find a janitor. "You're a mess, Your Majesty," he whispered, a tiny, crooked smile touching his lips. "I am," she agreed, pressing her forehead against his. "And I think I'm going to stay a mess for a very long time." Upstairs, in the medical bay, I stood with Jackson and the guards, watching the monitors as the sub-chamber's life support systems flickered back to life. The nitrogen levels were dropping. The temperature was rising. "They're alive," I said, my voice cracking with relief. Jackson didn't answer. He was looking at the screen, at the image of the High Architect of the Syzygy hegemony holding a Terran janitor in the middle of a frozen maintenance room. He reached up and slowly removed his helmet, revealing a face that was no longer a mask of professional distance. He looked humbled. He looked like a man who had just realized that his entire definition of strength was a lie. "She went down," Jackson whispered, more to himself than to me. "She went into the grime." "She didn't just go down, Commander," I said, recording the moment for the ages. "She chose the wait. And in doing so, she just saved more than our lives. She saved our soul." The transformation of the Lumina Aegis had begun. It wasn't just about the repairs or the hunting down of traitors. It was a resonance shift in the very heart of our culture. We had spent centuries trying to float, only to find that our true power lay in the things that held us down. I looked at the data crystal in my hand. I knew that the report I was writing would change everything. It would be a story of blood, of frost, and of a man who timed the universe in 3 minutes and 14 seconds. It would be a story of an invisible man who taught a queen how to be real. And most of all, it would be a story about the 61 beats per minute that became the new heart song of the galaxy. The medical team arrived at the hatch 10 minutes later. They were carrying thermal wraps and high-energy nutrient infusions, their movements efficient and respectful. But as they lowered the levitation stretchers into the shaft, they moved with a new kind of care. They didn't just see a patient or a queen. They saw the architecture. When Kalin was finally brought up, he was wrapped in a golden Lumerian light shroud, his breath steady, his heart beating a slow, stubborn rhythm. Valora walked beside him, her hand never leaving his. She was still covered in frost and grime, her robes torn, her skin bruised. But as she walked through the corridors of her ship, the Lumerian crew didn't turn away. They didn't step over her. They bowed, not to her title, not to her light, but to the weight she carried. I followed them toward the medical bay, my stylus flying across the crystal. I knew there were still 4 chapters of this story to tell. I had to write about the recovery. I had to write about the trial of Valerius. I had to write about the new classification for the maintenance staff. But as I watched Kalin and Valora disappear into the medical sanctuary, I realized that the climax of the story had already happened. It hadn't been the fight, or the purge. It had been the moment a goddess chose to get her hands dirty. The humanistic theme had moved from subtext to the very air we breathed. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the woman who crawled into the dark because she refused to let the light go out alone. And the value of invisible labor? It was the 94 kilograms of human mass that was currently the only thing keeping the High Architect of the Syzygy hegemony grounded in her own reality. "Are you getting all this, Scribe?" Jackson asked, stepping up beside me. He looked at my data crystal with a new kind of interest. "Every word, Commander," I said. "Good," he said, his voice deep and thoughtful. "Because I think we're going to need to update the training manuals. I want the guard to spend a week in the maintenance tunnels. They need to learn how to handle a mop." I smiled. I think Kalin would like that. He always did say the floors were a disaster. We walked on, the gold and silver light of the ship surrounding us. The Lumina Aegis was no longer a ship of song and light. It was a ship of iron, of blood, and of a stubborn, beautiful weight. And for the first time in 3 centuries, it felt like home. The recovery did not happen in a flash of light or a surge of restorative energy. It was a slow, agonizing crawl back to the living, measured in the hiss of medical vapor and the rhythmic, grounding beep of a heart monitor that refused to let go. Kaelen Vance spent 4 days in a stasis coma, his body encased in a biosynthetic lattice that worked to repair the cellular damage from the liquid nitrogen and the structural failure of his ribcage. Outside the medical sanctuary, the Lumina Aegis was a ship transformed. The Kraden boarding parties had been neutralized, their matte black hulks dragged into the cargo holds for deconstruction. But the real change was internal. The silence that had once defined the syzygy hegemony, that curated, sterile perfection, was gone. In its place was a new kind of sound, the clatter of tools, the shouting of orders, and the heavy, ungraceful thud of boots on deck plating. I spent most of those 4 days in the archives, but I was no longer just recording the deeds of the High Architect. I was rewriting the very definition of our history. Every time I looked at my data crystal, I saw the blood on the floor of the observation tier, and I realized that for 22 years I had been writing a fairy tale. Kaelen Vance had brought the truth, and the truth was heavy. "You're still at it, scribe?" I looked up to see Commander Jackson standing in the doorway. He looked different. His iridescent armor was gone, replaced by a simple, practical duty suit of reinforced charcoal fabric. He was carrying a heavy-duty thermal wrench, and there was a streak of dark grease across his high, noble cheekbone. "I am trying to find the right words for the trial, Commander," I said, gesturing to the holographic documents floating around me. "Counselor Valerius is to be sentenced tomorrow. The High Architect has requested a full transcript of his failure." Jackson walked into the room, his footsteps sounding solid and real. He set the wrench down on my desk with a heavy clink. "Don't call it a failure, Ilara. Call it an obsolescence. Valerius wasn't just a traitor. He was a symptom of a ship that forgot how to bleed. He thought strength was something you could buy from a Kraden warlord because he'd never had to earn it himself." "You've been in the maintenance tunnels again," I noted, looking at the grease on his face. Jackson let out a short, dry laugh. "I spent the morning helping the engineering crew replace the primary plasma couplers. My hands are blistered. My back feels like it's been hit by a freight train, and I've never felt more like a soldier in my entire life." He looked at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly from the exertion. Kalin was right. We were living in the rafters. It's a long way down, but the air is clearer at the bottom. The trial of Valerius was held not in the Grand Council chamber, but in the observation tier, right in front of the shattered bulkhead that was still being repaired. It was a calculated move by Valora. She wanted the evidence of the crime to be the witness to the judgment. Valerius stood in the center of the room, his silver skin dull and gray, his hands bound by the same industrial zip ties Kalin had used on the Kraden. He looked at the High Architect with a mixture of fear and a lingering, stubborn arrogance. "You are sentencing me for seeking a future that was stronger than your past, Valora," Valerius said, his voice echoing through the ruined room. "You are choosing to remain fragile." Valora stood on the crystalline dais, her amber light glowing with a steady, unbreakable fire. She looked at him with a pity that was more devastating than any sentence of death. "We were fragile because we believed that strength was an aesthetic, Valerius," she said. We believed that if we sang loud enough, the universe would forget we were made of flesh and bone. But a man who is only a janitor showed us that the future isn't something you dream about. It's something you build with your hands, minute by minute, 3 minutes, and 14 seconds at a time. She stepped down from the dais and walked toward him. She didn't look like a goddess. She looked like a woman who had seen the frost and survived it. "You are not being sentenced to death, Valerius," she said. "That would be too light a burden. You are being sentenced to service. You will be stripped of your titles, your resonance nodes will be deactivated, and you will be assigned to the sanitation and maintenance crew of the lower decks. You will learn the value of the grime you despised. You will learn to clean the floors you tried to sell." The silence that followed was absolute. For a Lumerian noble, being consigned to the maintenance crew was a fate worse than execution. It was the total erasure of their social identity. Valerius collapsed to his knees, his silver skin turning a frantic, shivering violet. You can't do this," he wheezed. "I can," Valora said, her voice dropping to a low, grounding rumble. "And I will. Because if you want to be part of the new syzygy, you have to start from the foundations. Take him away." As the guards led the broken counselor out of the room, Jackson stepped up to Valora's side. He didn't bow. He simply stood there, an anchor in the shifting light. "The crew is responding well to the new protocols, Your Majesty," Jackson said. "The heavy lifters are no longer being referred to as invisible. We've started a cross-training program. My guards are learning to handle the ship's primary systems. We won't be caught hollow again." Valora nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the viewport. "And the human? How is he?" "The med auto says he'll be upright by this evening," Jackson said, a small smile touching his lips. "Though he's already been complaining that the medical bay floor is streaky. He tried to get out of the biosynthetic lattice an hour ago because he said he heard a leak in the ventilation ducts." Valora let out a soft musical laugh. "Then he is truly recovering. I will see him tonight. Alone, Jackson. I don't want a guard. I want a conversation." I watched them from the shadows of the doorway, my stylus flying across the crystal. I realized then that the conflict wasn't just about a traitor or a boarding party. It was a conflict between the myth of ourselves and the reality of our existence. We had spent 3 centuries trying to escape the gravity of our own nature, and it had taken a man from a world of mud to pull us back down. As I walked back toward the archives, I passed through Sector 7. The floors were gleaming, the air was fresh, and the ship was humming with a new, deeper resonance. I saw a group of Lumerian engineers working alongside a Terran mechanic, their hands covered in the same black grease. Their voices joined in a shared, practical conversation about pressure valves and heat shields. There were no songs. There was no light show. Just the quiet, steady rhythm of people doing their jobs. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever recorded. 10 days after the breach, Kaelen Vance was finally back in his jumpsuit. He was standing in the middle of the royal antechamber, the very room where the 3-minute war had begun. The floor had been fully restored, the silver-flecked tiles replaced with a new, more durable composite that Kalin had personally selected from the ship's stores. It didn't shimmer as much as the old floor, but it felt solid. It felt like it could take a hit. He was holding his new mop, a high-grade titanium alloy shaft with a multi-phase applicator head that could handle everything from biological spills to corrosive coolants. He looked at the floor with a critical eye, his jaw set in that familiar evaluative expression. "It's not perfect," he muttered to himself, leaning on the mop. "The reflection on the north corner is about 2 degrees off. Going to need to hit that with a buffing pad before the morning watch. I think it's a masterpiece, Kalin. He turned to see High Architect Valora standing in the doorway. She wasn't wearing her crown or her ceremonial robes. She wore a simple tunic of deep amber, her skin glowing with a soft, warm light that matched the morning suns of the Syzygy system. "Masterpiece is a big word for a floor, Your Majesty," Kalin said, though he didn't pull away this time. He stood his ground, his feet planted firmly on the tiles he had laid. "It's just a surface. It's meant to be walked on." "And that is exactly why it is a masterpiece," Valora said, walking toward him. Her footsteps didn't click or chime. They made a soft, human thud. "It is a surface that supports us. It is a foundation that doesn't ask for praise. It just exists." She stopped in front of him and reached out, her hand hovering for a second before she placed it firmly on his shoulder. Her skin was warm, not the artificial warmth of a heater, but the radiating, vibrant heat of a woman who was fully present in her own body. "The Council has finished the reclassification," she said. "Effective immediately, the Environmental Maintenance Department is being integrated into the primary command structure. You are no longer an environmental technician, Kalin." Kalin winced. "I told you, I'm not a fan of fancy titles. Does this mean I have to wear one of those iridescent capes? Because if it does, I'm putting in my 2-week notice." Valora laughed. "No capes. Your new title is Architect of Foundations. It comes with a significant salary increase, a seat on the Inner Council, and the authority to override any security or navigation protocol if you believe the ship's physical integrity is at risk." Kalin was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "And the floors? I still get to do the floors?" "Only if you want to," Valora said. "But I suspect you'll find that the entire ship is now your floor. We have a lot of grime to clear away, Kalin. Not just on the decks, but in the way we think, in the way we live." Kalin looked down at his mechanical watch. It was ticking steadily, the seconds passing with a quiet, unrelenting precision. He looked at the scars on his hands, the faint red line on his forehead where the glass had broken, and the way his left side still ached when the ship made a sharp transit correction. "Physics is a funny thing," Kalin said, his voice dropping into that deep, gravelly register that I had come to associate with the truth. "You can spend your whole life trying to float, trying to be light, trying to be more than the mud you came from. But in the end, the gravity always finds you. It's not a punishment. It's a connection. It's what reminds you that you're real." He looked at Valora, and for the first time, I saw a genuine, unburdened smile on his face. It wasn't the smile of a servant or a hero. It was the smile of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I'll take the job," Kalin said. "But I'm keeping the mop. I don't trust those automated units to get the corners right." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Valora said. As they walked out of the antechamber together, I stayed behind for a moment, looking at the floor. I saw the reflection of the overhead lights, the clean, unbroken lines that stretched toward the horizon. I saw the residue of the struggle, the subtle patterns in the composite that only a thorough person would notice. I thought about Gaia Prime, the heavy planet that had shaped Kaelen Vance. I thought about the thousands of years of evolution, the struggle against the Earth, the sheer, stubborn will to stand up when everything wanted to pull you down. And I realized that we weren't the ones who were advanced. We were the ones who were unfinished. Kaelen Vance hadn't just saved our ship. He had given us the missing piece of our own identity. He had given us the weight. I looked at my data crystal and began to write the final entry of the Lumina Aegis Chronicles. I spent most of my life thinking that being invisible was a curse. I thought that the grime under my fingernails was a mark of shame, a sign that I hadn't made it as far as the guys in the shiny suits. I looked at the Lumerians, and I saw a race of gods, and I felt like a piece of grit in their perfect gears. But standing in that frozen subchamber, feeling my heart slow down to almost nothing, I realized something I should have known a long time ago. The grit isn't what breaks the machine. The grit is what provides the friction. Without friction, you can't move. You can't stop. You just slide into the void until you hit something hard enough to shatter you. I look at this ship now, and I don't see a palace of light. I see a piece of machinery that needs constant care. I see a group of people who are finally starting to feel the weight of their own bones. And I realize that my job hasn't changed. I'm still the guy who handles the mess. I'm still the one who looks at the foundations while everyone else is looking at the stars. But I'm not invisible anymore. And I don't need a letter home to tell my sister that I'm doing something important. I can feel it in every step I take. I can feel it in the way the floor holds me up. We're all load-bearing architecture now, and as long as I've got a mop and a steady heartbeat, I think we're going to be just fine. As I look out over the vast, shimmering expanse of the galaxy, I find myself thinking about the foundations of our own lives. We all want to be the light. We all want to be the song that everyone hears. But in the quiet moments, when the darkness closes in and the world feels like it's losing its resonance, I wonder, who is the invisible person in your world who keeps your floors clean and your lights on? And when was the last time you truly looked at them? Not as a function, but as the anchor holding your universe together. Kaelen Vance walked down the corridor of Sector 7, the rhythmic slap of his mop echoing against the walls. He didn't look back. He just kept moving, one steady, heavy step at a time toward the next mess that needed Don Depp. The floor was perfect.